We're super excited to have Carolyn Jung here, who is the author of that fabulous book in your gift bag. I first crossed paths with Carolyn this summer when we did a high school internship pilot with Bon Appetit at Google. And it was so funny. I was sitting down with my contact at Bon Appetit. Her name is Mariah. And I said, oh, we found this really great book. We want to give it to the interns as kind of a takeaway of this experience to really be able to showcase chefs and their, fabulous recipes and their background. And I showed her the book, and she goes, well, just wait a minute. We had Carolyn Jung here for the Googlers not too long ago. And I go, what? So it was a super wonderful opportunity to have her this summer talk to our high school students about the power of their internship and her experience with the culinary experts. But when we were planning this event, I thought, oh, goodness, I got to make that call again to Carolyn, because I thought that it would be so great to be able to give these books to you as takeaways as part of today's event, but also to be able to utilize some of the recipes in your classrooms and to be able to talk about the chefs that are showcased in the book. And so, because I'm not the expert in giving the book all the attention it deserves, I am going to turn it over to Carolyn to chat with you about it. So welcome, Carolyn. We're thrilled to have you.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this snazzy new building, which is very impressive looking. Some of you may know my name. I was many years a food writer at the San Jose Mercury News. I now freelance for a number of publications locally and nationally, and I do my own blog, foodgal.com. So I was born and raised in San Francisco. So when people ask me, how did my love of food come about? I say, hey, that's where I was born. It's kind of in my blood. So when I was growing up, my best friend and I, when we were in high school, we didn't give each other normal birthday and Christmas presents. What we did was we saved up our money and we took each other out to eat at like Chez Panisse. And on the weekends, we would get together and bake. And one of our favorite things to do was when our parents were off doing something for the evening, we would get together and cook at home. Even if it was something, lame like hamburger helper, it was like thrilling to us. And we would hold a wooden spoon up to each other and pretend that we were on a cooking show. So despite all that, never in my wildest dreams did I think I would ever do a cookbook of my own. So how did this all come about? I will say to every one of you out there, always check your email inbox, because you never know what's going to pop up in there, which is what happened in my case last spring. It was early in the morning. I just had my first cup of coffee, and I was kind of bleary-eyed, scrolling. And here I see this email from the publisher asking, would you like to do this cookbook, San Francisco Chef's Table? And she explained that they do this series of cookbooks around the country. For instance, there's Brooklyn Chef's Table, there's New Orleans Chef's Table, Austin Chef's Table, and for some unordinary reason, there was no San Francisco Chef's Table yet, and I was shocked at that. So of course, I was thrilled to be asked to do this, but then I almost had a heart attack when she told me the deadline, 3 months. It was crazy, yeah. Apparently, this particular publisher works under a very tight deadline. So I knew I had my work cut out for me, and it was going to be a real challenge, but also a lot of fun. So one of the first things I did was I roped my good friend Craig Lee into doing the photos for this book. And Craig sends his regards. He was supposed to be here today, but he had a last-minute work assignment that he had to do. So Craig and I actually started out as competitors. He was the main food photographer for the Chronicle, and I worked at the Mercury News. But we saw each other, at various events. And then when I started freelance, I was writing for the Chronicle, and I'd be at a restaurant interviewing a chef, and lo and behold, who would show up to take the photos but Craig. So when I said yes to do this cookbook, I immediately emailed him and I said, please, please, please do this with me. And luckily he said yes, because the greatest thing working with him was he knew most of these restaurants and chefs already, so that when he showed up there, they were thrilled that he was there. It was like meeting an old friend again that they'd worked with before. So my other task at hand was to choose the restaurants, and I was instructed to choose about 50 or 60 restaurants in the Bay Area. And that's not an easy thing to do, given all the wonderful places there are to eat in the Bay Area. We're so, so lucky. So I actually, when I got this cookbook contract, I was scheduled to leave to Maui a couple days later to judge a cooking contest. And so the minute I got on the plane, and I'm very old school, so I pulled out a pad and a pen, and I immediately just started jotting down names of chefs that I knew I wanted to be in the book. And how I went about it was, I wanted this cookbook more than anything to be usable. I mean, how many gorgeous cookbooks do you see out there where you thumb through it, it looks great, but there's no way you're ever going to cook from this. The recipes are like 4 pages long. The ingredients lists go on and on and on. You got to go to like 4 different stores to get everything, and you just know I'm not going to do this. So I wanted recipes that people would actually want to do, could do in their own homes. So that meant that I would leave out a number of the very high-end, very cutting-edge restaurants in the Bay Area that, in particular do molecular gastronomy type cooking. I love that kind of cooking. I'm in awe of that kind of cooking, but let's face it, none of us do that at home, and that's why we go out to eat, right? We want that as a special thing because we can't do it ourselves. So I also wanted to choose restaurants that were very representative of the Bay Area. We are so lucky to live in a community of so many cultures, from so many ethnicities, and I wanted a range of that. And I also know these days people are very health conscious, allergy conscious, so I wanted to have vegetarian recipes. I wanted to have gluten-free. I wanted to have Japanese recipes, Korean recipes, South American, you name it, a good range. And I also wanted to have the hottest restaurants in the city now, such as State Bird Provisions. I mean, you can't even get into the restaurant now. They're so popular. They're, James Beard, best new restaurant from a year ago. And then I also wanted some very iconic San Francisco restaurants, like Swan Oyster Depot, that has been there forever and is this tiny, tiny, wonderful place full of characters. So that's how I kind of completed my list. And then, of course, it was contacting the chefs. So not to disparage any chefs in the room or wannabe chefs, but chefs are not good with deadlines for the most part. And it's not because they, don't want to be diligent, but of course they have so much to deal with. Their schedules are crazy. The last thing they want is someone calling them for a recipe and permission to come shoot in their restaurant because they've got so many other things going on. So it was a real experience trying to deal with 50, 55 of them. I think one pastry chef I worked with put it best. She said, God, I got to give you a hand for doing this because I imagine it's like wrangling a bunch of stray cats together. And I said, yeah, it kind of is like that. So, I would tell them, hey, I'd love you to be in this book. Can we call each other again in 2 weeks and you can tell me what you're thinking of doing, what kind of recipe? 2 weeks would go by and I'd call them and they would answer, oh, was I supposed to get that to you today? Yes, you were. And so on and on it would kind of go. So that was really challenging. The other thing I had to keep track of course, was I was doing this book during spring and summer, and we're very farm to table. We're very seasonal in the Bay Area, so everybody wanted to do something with corn. Everyone wanted to do something with tomatoes, peaches, and I said, no, 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 no. We already have 2 people doing peaches. We have 2 people doing corn. You need to pick something else. So that was, a lot of spreadsheets, a lot of notes, keeping track of things. And then the other challenging part was that some chefs are incredibly good at writing a recipe for a home cook. It's like flawless. Others, they need a little help because it's not what they do on a normal basis. They don't cook from a recipe. They, for the most part, don't write recipes down. So working with some of the people that I did, they would hand in a recipe that fed like 40 people. And I'm like, no, 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 we need to cut that down. Or they would give me recipes in grams. And I'd say, no, people don't do that at home. I know you want to be really exact, and chefs like to weigh everything, but people at home do not do that. So I need it in imperial measurements. I think one of the stories I liked best, and it kind of made me roll my eyes at time, that kind of summed up the process, was I got this recipe from a pastry chef who, I love her stuff, I adore her. I think it was originally supposed to make enough for 40 people. And I said, we got to cut this down. So we cut it. And so she sent me the ingredients list, and, it was fairly extensive. And then she sent me like 1 sentence for the directions, which were, make an anglaise, burr it, but don't add too much air. And I was like, what? What the heck is this? And so through a month-long process of emails and phone calls of trying to sort of nail her down on what exactly are you making here? And, we need to go step by step. After like even a month of that, she at one point emailed me and said, oh, by the way, did I tell you you need to put this in an ice cream maker? No. So there were things like that happened. Other things, we had shot the photos, I had edited the recipe, I had written the intro for another restaurant, and lo and behold, the chef leaves and takes most of his kitchen crew with him. And so I was left thinking, oh my God, we don't know the future of this restaurant. Will it stay the same? Will it morph into something completely different? So after a talk with my publisher, we decided we're going to have to yank it, which was sad because it was a really wonderful recipe, and fried chicken, by the way. But we couldn't use it because we just didn't know what the future held for that restaurant, and actually it did morph into something completely different. And the other things that happened were we had one chef who he kind of dilly-dallied about converting his measurements into grams for me, and it got to the point where I needed to turn in the manuscript in like 4 days. And I said, look, we've taken the photos, we've written everything. We want you to be in the book, but we can't just have photos. We need a recipe. And he's like, yeah. I'll do it. And even the photographer who happened to live not too far from this restaurant said, let me go talk to him. I'll go walk over there. And so he went over there and he said, look, we really need this now for you to be in the book. And so deadline passed. I turned in the manuscript without his recipe. And then lo and behold, like 3 days later, he emails me the information. And so I scrambled to my publisher and I said, look, is it too late? Because we have it all now. We could put this one in. And she goes, it's fine. So that one went into the book. So it was kind of a crazy experience to have to do this in 3 months. I mean, ideally, if I had 6 months, it would have been wonderful. But to cram it into 3, and I was also doing other freelancing at the time, I think my head was spinning on some days. And I know for Craig, he was shooting multiple assignments sometimes. But I think he got the best part, though, because he got to eat all the food after he photographed it. So So I wish he was here today to tell you some of the most wonderful things he got to eat. I think one of his favorites, though, because I remember him emailing me after the shoot, and it was the mudslide cookies from Prospect Restaurant. And Craig is not a baker. His wife is a wonderful cook, but Craig doesn't really cook too much or bake. And he emailed me and he goes, "Oh my God, these cookies are amazing. I'm going to bake them." And then I knew, okay, these are something special. And in fact, that cookie recipe, if not by timing, also might not have ended up in the book, because this particular pastry chef had been at another restaurant. And when I started working on the book, I contacted the restaurant and they said, "Oh, he's left." And I was like, "Oh no." And so I emailed him directly and I said, "Where are you working now?" And he goes, "Oh, I'm taking a break." And I'm like, "No, don't take a break now." I explained to him, I said, "I'm doing a cookbook. I'd love for you to be in it, but you need to be associated with a restaurant or a bakery, or you need to be doing pop-ups or something, some place where people can actually try your stuff." And so he goes, "Well, I might be getting another job soon. I'll keep you posted." And so luckily, I think a month and a half into the process, he emailed one day and said, "Carolyn, I'm working at a restaurant now." And I was like, yay, because Rodney Surden, he makes the most amazing cookies. And I knew, because I have a giant sweet tooth, I admit, that when I did this cookbook, that I wanted to have a really decadent cookie in this book. And he was the man for the job. And definitely he was, because my friends, I roped a lot of my friends into testing recipes for me. I'd say, "Hey, you like to bake, right? Can you make this and see, if it works, if there's any issues with it?" And so my friend Carolyn made this, and it took her a few days to do it because unfortunately we were going through a heat wave then, and she was reluctant to turn on the oven for that long. But she did, and then she emailed me and she goes, "Wow, these are really special. My husband ate like 4 of them right when they came out of the oven." So then I knew, thank God, that, I had Rodney in this book. So some of my, favorite things are in this book. The butterscotch pudding from One Market Restaurant that all the Lark Creek Restaurant Group's restaurant feature is something that I've made many times for dinner parties. And I love it because it actually has a little bit of real scotch in it, which I really think you need for a good butterscotch pudding, right? Right? And some of my other favorite recipes, I think, are the ribs from State Bird Provisions. Like I said, it's a restaurant that's incredibly difficult to get into. And I remember eating these ribs and remarking on how incredibly tender they were to the chef. And I asked him, "Well, how did you cook them?" And he goes, "Good old-fashioned tin foil." And he said, "You thought I was going to say sous vide, didn't you?" And I said, "Yeah, I did. But actually the key to it is you cook them in the oven, and you take them out for an hour, still covered with foil, and their juices all sort of reconstitute back into the meat, and they are so incredible. Then you just kind of finish them off on the grill." And my other favorite thing in the book is, and this one is a recipe that many of my friends have made. I made this also last Christmas for gifts for people, which is one of my favorite bakeries in San Francisco. And if you guys have not been there, you should go immediately. Bee Patisserie. Anyone been there? Yeah, you know what I mean, right? Yeah. Belinda is incredible. She makes the most flaky, buttery, and possibly wonderful French pastries around. When I go to San Francisco, if I am anywhere in the vicinity, I must stop there. Same with my other friends who live on a peninsula in South Bay. We just make a beeline there. So I, too, asked her for a cookie recipe because, let's face it, we're not going to be making our own croissants at home or Queen Amans because that's just kind of a lot of work. And most of us just don't have that in us. But we can make a cookie, right? So her almond cookie is the stuff of dreams. It's made with pulverized almonds, and it's so intensely almond and this wonderful crisp texture. And I tell you, make it for your friends this Christmas, and they will love you for life. So I hope you guys all enjoy the book, and if anyone has any questions, just let me know. Yes?
What could we say to a high schooler who wants to get into this field, be that kind of writer? What?
Well, I know that various food writers have come up through this path in many different ways. I know chefs who have gone into writing. I know other people who are you've seen the phenomenon these days of moms at home with kids. They start a blog, and next thing you know, they have a cookbook. A lot of that happening. I came up, I guess, through the old school way, which is I went to journalism school, and most of my career has been spent working for newspapers. And actually, half of my career was working in hard news. So I covered everything from plane crashes to trials to many, many long city council meetings. And I actually was covering race and demographics issues at the Mercury News when our food editor at the time, who'd left on maternity leave, decided not to come back. And I actually honestly never thought about doing food writing. I mean, as much as I love food, I was happy doing what I was doing. And then my friends, who, probably just incessantly listening to me talk about what I baked over the weekend, what restaurant I've gone to, or asking them, where are we going to go eat today? And they came over to me and said, well, you're going to apply for this, right? Because, this is your job. Your name's written all over this. And I said, really? You think so? So one of my friends gave me the best advice, which was she had jumped around a lot to various beats. She covered sports, she covered news, and then she was a mom and freelancing, working part-time for the paper, actually writing for the food section. And she goes, this is what you do. Go home tonight, get a piece of paper and a pencil. Give yourself 5 minutes to think of story ideas for your current beat. And then give yourself another 5 minutes to come up with story ideas for the food beat. So I'm almost embarrassed to say that I came up with these many ideas for the food beat, and probably this many for my own beat that I was covering at the time. So I think that answered that for me. And so the next day I applied for the job, and it was probably the best decision I've ever made. Who doesn't like to talk and read about food? I joke that, my parents used to read all the stories that I wrote, even though a lot of them were about planning commission meetings in some city that they could care less about, but they read them anyway. But then when I started writing about food, it was something they actually enjoyed reading. So advice to students, I would say, if you know that you want to come up through the ranks and go the writing route as opposed to working in a restaurant, though you can do both. Take some writing courses. Even start a blog if you have the time or the inclination to do so. Contact your local papers. I know when I was at the Mercury News, we had a couple of chefs at the time who would write columns for us. Some wrote about, seasonal ingredients and dishes you could use them. Others wrote, we had one chef who worked at the French Laundry a while back. He wrote about what it was like, some of his experiences in the kitchen as he worked his way around France and California. And it was kind of fascinating because it was all through, his eyes. So I think, writing, just like cooking, the more you do, the better you get at it, the more comfortable you become. So just kind of, dive in and don't be afraid of picking up the phone and contacting people and seeing and asking, hey, I'd love to do a story for you on this, that, or the other. Would you be interested?
So just one more question. We have time for one more question because we have culinary techniques training coming up right after. So do we have one closing question?
I've got
on the book. So some of the chefs in the book, like Michael Chiarello and Ricardo, they have their own cookbooks
Yes.
they put out. Did you give them parameters on like something new and different that hadn't been published, or you just?
Yeah, what we were looking for, the chefs are still own the rights to these recipes, so they can reuse them if they wanted to. But for the most part, we're looking for something that hadn't been published before.